So, of course, I recently put out a video that probably was a little a little drama, very very tiny bit, right? And that got some people upset on X. You know, the war game related people, the people that claim D&D is a war game. It's not. It's clearly not a war game. Is there aspects and inspiration that comes from that, that hobby? Of course there is. Can you find language, in the game that will have to do with that? But that's the same thing as finding language like character development in the writing or something like that that comes from other worlds and other things that help make up what we call tabletop role-playing games. So it's like, I get a kick out of simple-minded people. You'll make the clear and obvious case that it's not a war game, right? And they'll say like, well, the word campaign is in there. Where does that come from? It's like the word's character development. That term is in there. Where does that come from? It doesn't mean we're actors, right? It's like, of course, there are words that come from some of the inspiration that leads to the game being developed, but there's so many sides to what a tabletop role-playing game is. It's not one, and there's only certain aspects from each side borrowed to make a sort of combination thing that comes together to be its own thing, right? Wargaming is wargaming. D&D is not wargaming. It's just a different beast altogether. People on X a few people are upset with me about the wargaming thing, because all you got to do is tell some old school guy who has a deceitful agenda about wargaming, D&D is not wargaming. You're going to be right. It's not wargaming. But man, some old guys are going to lose their minds because there's a lot of things they justify behind that statement that just doesn't hold water. And it's like, dude, I'm sorry. It just doesn't hold water. It's not wargaming. Wargaming is wargaming. You have to explain that. I mean, you got to understand, like 90% of wargamers back when D&D first came out rejected D&D, saying it's not wargaming and it's not something that will replace wargaming. I mean, a complete rejection. I don't care what people in modern times say. You got to go back to the real wargamers and their honest take on D&D, the fairy game. They rejected it, and for good reason. And of course, I mean, you could simplify it down, but it is what it is. The majority of DMs from 1974, depends on when you want to start, but from 1974, say, when it officially comes out with Dungeons and Dragons, from then till the late 90s, the majority of DMs do pure theater of the mind. They don't even use miniatures from wargaming, and this is the majority. And you see in the early 90s, some of the guys in the hobby start experimenting with plastic, making their own plastic, making some plastic figurines, doing a bit more on terrain than they've done even in the 80s. And then by the early 2000s, WotC finally just says, okay, we're just going to go straight to plastic. No more experimenting, we're going to make it plastic. And so then you start seeing more people from the early 2000s, even with old school D&D, because now plastic figurines are available, more people definitely started using miniatures commonly. But from 1974 to late 1990s, the majority of DMs in the entire hobby ran the game pure theater of the mind because it wasn't a war game. I think some guys have an agenda. I know they do. But if you go back in the old school era, you see it today. Here's what weirds me out, Black Rose. I never met anybody in 1987 who argued that D&D was a war game. Actually, the war gamers hated the fairy game D&D. 90% of them never crossed over into the hobby. They fucking hated D&D and said, because at first, from what I heard back in 1974, at first, wargamers thought that D&D was some attempt to replace their hobby. Not that it was wargaming, but an attempt to bring another hobby that would replace their hobby. And they gave that up after a few years, realizing it's not replacing because it's not even the same thing. It's just a completely different thing. And the fact that it's not wargaming is why they calmed down. Yeah, I think the wargaming thing, especially nowadays, has to do with justifying a lot of silliness. It's like the miniature thing. It's I had AJ Pickett on here, who's someone who, like many of the, if you're properly in the old school, back in the late '90s, because from '74 up to like the '90s, the majority of DMs do pure theater of the mind. That's just commonplace. That is so common, it's silly. Very few people use miniatures. I mean, some do, but very few. You're talking like 1% to 2% of the entire hobby is using miniatures in any regular way. You get the rest of people really not. In the early '90s, though, it went from a painting hobby to people attempting to bring it more into the gaming world. That was, AJ talks about it, them making their own plastics. And why would they start making their own plastics in the early '90s? Because most people, it's a barrier. Most people cannot, especially kids, cannot afford the metal miniatures. The majority of hobby is young people, and they had to bring their money, and a lot of poor people do. They had to bring their money together just to buy, like, the books. Like, think about it, most groups have to cycle their money together through the different kids to buy books. Nobody's buying a miniature. Almost nobody could afford them. Right? It's only into the early '90s you start seeing people finally start making their own plastic, which is, I mean, genius stuff, right? And because there's more plastic miniatures starting to be made by these amateur groups, you do start seeing their attempt to actually start making more terrain. But note, they're not experimenting on making terrain this way until the early '90s. Hey, Bill probably knows what I'm talking about, and I'm not shitting on the history of D&D. I think it's actually cool. I have nothing against talk about the real history. They start focusing more on the terrains and miniatures in the early '90s, and because now you got plastics being made finally in miniatures, so that some of the groups are actually having miniatures to actually be able to do some stuff. So they start experimenting, and AJ was talking about AJ Pickett it's a great talk I had with him, because they start coming up with all the different ways to make the terrains and experimenting with lower walls, higher walls you can't see. But from 1974 up to the early '90s, it's almost not happening because most kids can barely afford the books that are coming into the hobby. And even most of the adults are just playing pure theater of the mind, because it's a lot of non-war gamers. They're actually just doing the default way of doing combat.